My name is Rob Monaco, and I'd like to welcome you to the very first episode of the podcast history of our world. This is where it all begins, my attempt to weave a cohesive narrative of humanity's time here on Earth. A story that starts at the earliest beginning of all things and concludes in the modern age. Eventually. In each chapter, we'll traverse the globe, exploring the roots of our current societies, shining a light on cultures typically overlooked, and better understand the men and women who bent the world to their vision, for better or worse. Traditional history tends to focus on certain areas, politics, war, economics, stuff like that. But this program seeks out more. Art, philosophy, literature, religion, food, and this means spending time talking about interesting stuff. This isn't some slapdash adventure where we go from the Peloponnesian Wars to the Middle Ages in just 10 episodes. True, this podcast will move faster than other history shows, but we also have a lot more to cover. We simply can't get all hyper-focused about one topic of history. Otherwise, it'll be 3 years from now and we'll just be wrapping up the fall of the Roman Empire, and I'll have since quit the podcast to make a fortune developing history-themed video games. Why not? It could happen. But if you're worried there won't be enough detail, well, mark my words, you will learn. The format of this show is presenting history in a light-hearted fashion. I don't do the stuffy lecture thing well. Expect to connect with the events and characters in ways you didn't think possible from history. Also corny jokes. Not too much, but it can't be helped. This is also being recorded as a linear story, meaning that we spend a certain amount of time with one civilization before switching to another to catch those folks up to where we are in the timeline. And I do mean story, because each episode I've devoted many hours to rewriting a narrative to hopefully capture your attention. Why do history like this? Well, because, let's just say I'm a devotee of the big man of history, the ancient Greek writer Herodotus. Hey, who just called him the father of lies? That's slander, and I oughta... Alright, maybe he took some rumors as truth. And maybe he fudged the facts a bit. Okay, fine, and he fabricated almost all the dialogue, like we're so perfect. Well, my man Herodotus might not know about journalistic integrity, but he's still read over 2,000 years later, and it's still enjoyable. And that's the big thing here. It's always been my belief that history is best enjoyed as a grand story. And it's far better than any fiction novel, because the truth can be two different things depending on the account you read. Heroes become villains, and terrorists become freedom fighters. Just consider how near demonic the Spanish conquistadors must have appeared to the Aztecs. Long beards, metal armor, the sounds of cannon fire and hoofbeats roaring through their doomed capital city Tenochtitlan. Or conversely, how savagely barbaric the Aztecs appeared to the Spanish, dressing in animal skins and feathers, worshipping a flayed god, plunging obsidian daggers into captive and screaming prisoners while their still beating hearts are torn from their chests. You get my point. Is either side wrong? No, but neither is either side right. And so we will try our best to observe history from a humanistic perspective. That means sometimes taking sides, sometimes criticizing and judging, and other times celebrating the good our ancestors achieved. History is about real people who lived and breathed and fought and loved. But it's also about the people and events that may be lacking evidence, but persist on. It's not ancient aliens. It's a wish to hear forgotten names heard once more. So what do you think? Are you ready to join me on a trip through time? I'll take that as a yes. And before we start, you can always find me on Twitter, @PodcastHistory, on Facebook, or the easiest way is just to visit podcasthistoryofourworld.com. Come peruse the bibliography, check out episode resources, think about buying a shirt or a sticker, or even supporting me on Patreon, but maybe listen to a few episodes before you commit to that. Alright, podcastorians, here we go. There's no turning back now, so buckle up or hold on tight, because our adventure begins in 3, 2, 1. Chapter 1. Let There Be History. To paraphrase a pretty famous book, in the beginning, there was nothing. I know, I've already started the podcast off on a cliche, but this statement is not entirely true. In the beginning, there was everything, as well as a whole lot of nothing. Our universe, the only universe we definitely know of, began its existence as an unfathomably dense hot ball of matter, until it furiously expanded, creating all the hydrogen and helium in the universe in the first 30 minutes of what we'd refer to now as time. Incidentally, the Earth will run out of helium within about 25 to 30 years at our current rate of usage. It's a non-renewable resource, folks, and that's not good. Sure, it means no more squeaky cartoon chipmunk voices or balloons stuck in trees, but also no more MRIs. There's plenty to be found in asteroids, but, that's a whole other set of challenges. Where was I going with this? Well, anyway, moving closer to home, about 9 billion years after the initial expansion of the universe, we see the formation of our most favorite star, the Sun. 100 million years later, the planets are formed from mass that had been ejected from the Sun, but hadn't escaped its gravitational pull. These ranged from the massive gas giants like Neptune, where it rains hailstone-sized diamonds, to desolate Mercury, where temperatures fluctuate from about 400 degrees Fahrenheit in the day to minus 270 at night. And for reasons that still seem extraordinary to the point of miraculous, it was the third oblate spheroid from the Sun that had all the conditions necessary to become more than just some rock in space. Although at first, the Earth best resembled a hellish nightmare, with massive supervolcanoes belching forth torrents of lava, and enormous storms inundating the ground with enough water to create the first oceans. Once the planet finally cooled off and the weather calmed down a bit, 3.8 billion years ago from today, the very first life took form, in the guise of simple organisms. These intrepid little creatures begat more and more complex forms, evolving into the multicellular life around 1 billion years ago, and developing into, well, you know the rest of the story. There's always that one fish that crawls out of the water onto land, and then you've got amphibians, reptiles, tiny mammals, dinosaurs, birds. But it's not until about 2.5 million years ago that we see the introduction of the first member of the genus Homo. It's Homo habilis, the handyman. So called because this is the first time we see our relatives using tools in the form of stone flakes. From there we see Homo erectus, upright man, comes along about 1.5 million years later, Neanderthals about 600,000 years ago, and finally Homo sapiens, wise man, who wiped out our Neanderthal cousins through violence and interbreeding and spread across the world at a tremendous pace. I should mention that we have the Swedish taxonomer Carolus Linnaeus to thank for the title of sapiens. I'll leave it up to you to decide if this was sincerity or sarcasm. Right, so there you go. From universal creation to how we came to be. Imagine if things had turned out different and dinosaurs were the dominant species, or maybe some kind of bird people instead of us. Somewhat hairless, big-brained, upright apes. The Big Bang is the most commonly accepted scientific origin story, although who's to say what the future holds for this idea? I mean, as of now, the latest debates are over whether the universe has simply always existed. Because after all, what happened before the Big Bang? And what about multiverses, or Fermi's paradox, or if life is just some computer simulation dreamed up by some weird cosmic programmer? Some deep stuff, man. Which we're definitely not getting into. Leave that for Star Talk or Infinite Monkey Cage. Where I'm going with this is that what about when mankind was young and had no way of relying on science to explain the age-old question, why are we here? To that comes humanity's oldest attempt to seek answers from a world that does not reveal its secrets easily. I speak of the creation myth. Sure, we can dismiss these as metaphors and just stories nowadays, but to the people who committed these tales to heart as truth, they were very, very real. And that's where we begin our history, with the stories our ancestors told each other. Now, there are, of course, way more creation stories than we have time for, but for our first chapter, I've selected 3. We begin in the mountains of Georgia, the ancestral homeland of the Jalagi, or Cherokee. In the beginning, the earth was just water and darkness, but above it all was Galunlati, the great mystery, the stone vault that makes the sky where the animals lived. But now it was becoming too crowded for them, so they sent Water Beetle to explore the earth for land to live on. Water Beetle dove down below the water and brought forth mud. He did this over and over again, and eventually created the island of Earth. This island is suspended from its four corners by rope that hangs from the sky, which will one day snap, plunging the Earth back into the water. This new Earth, however, was still soft from the wet mud, but Buzzard flew down anyway, thinking he could land. He flapped his wings in vain to fly out of it, and as he did so, the valleys and mountains were formed, and they would become one day the Cherokee homeland. Eventually, though, the earth did dry, and the animals moved down. They banished the darkness by having the sun pass from east to west, and raised the sun every day so light could shine. After the animals came forth the plants, and after that, man appeared. They multiplied with speed, and though initially friends with the animals, began to hunt them more and more for food. The animals became alarmed at the humans' insatiable hunger, and so a great council was held and decided that any human who kills a deer without asking for permission will be cursed with rheumatism. The fish, birds, reptiles, and insects also met and came up with various diseases with which to afflict man. Eventually, though, the plants met and took pity on mankind. They agreed to provide medicine to counteract the curse of the animals, which is why so many herbs and trees provide antidotes and remedies to this day. As we listen to these myths, you'll notice there are similar themes and events that can be categorized as following a certain format, or featuring characters that fit a traditional archetype. In this story, for instance, we see the Earth Diver myth, where some creature or hero swims to the bottom of a watery earth in order to create the land or rescue some sacred object. In this case, it's the humble water beetle, but the Haudenosaunee have a similar tale where it's animals who create the land by smearing that submerged mud onto the back of a great turtle. Now, we also see the very specific creation of the Cherokee homeland, but no mention of any other people. The theme of unique creationism features prominently in many myths, but it is sometimes used as the basis to explain a culture's spiritual identity. Like in our next myth, where we will learn that the gods set out to create a series of islands, just for a particular population. Let's listen to the origins of Nihon and the Nihonjin, the creation myth of Japan. In the beginning of the universe, the male and female principles formed a sort of egg. When this egg hatched, the top part stretched out and became the heavens, while the bottom part stretched out to become the earth. On this young earth, the land floated like a fish on the surface of the water, when suddenly, a form like reed shoots sprouted and became the Koto Amatsu Kami, the distinguishing heavenly gods. Soon these reeds also produced the brother-sister gods Izanagi and Izanami, whose names mean male who invites and female who invites. They were tasked by the older gods to create the world and populate it. Standing on the floating bridge of heaven, they thrust down a jeweled naginata spear deep into the ocean. Then, while raising it, the water that dripped off the blade coagulated and became the island of Onogorojima. They descended down to this island and built the great palace, Yashiro-dono. When in the palace, the two met at a column. Izanami greeted her brother god and said, "What a fine young man." Izanagi greeted her and said, "What a fine young woman." They knew each other and procreated, but the child that came from their union was Hiroko, the leech child, and Awashima, the floating island. Disgusted by their monstrous children, they banished them from the palace and cast them off into the ocean. Worried that ones as eminent as they could produce such creatures, the brother-sister gods appealed to the kami about what went wrong. The kami explained that their failure producing strong offspring was the result of the female speaking first. This is unlucky, and why to this day it is appropriate for the man to ask first. Izanagi and Izanami returned to Onogoro Island to try again with the kami's advice, and this time, Izanami gave birth to the 8 great islands of Japan, along with a plethora of nature deities. Sadly, though, her son, Kagutsuchi, the fire spirit, would be the death of her, as his flames incinerated his mother at birth. Izanagi was consumed with grief and sliced off his son's head and dismembered his body. Izanagi then resolved himself to bring back his beloved and made the dangerous journey to Yomi, the land of the dead. Fumbling through the all-consuming darkness of the underworld in a desperate search, he felt the presence of Izanami's spirit and called out to her to return back to the land of the living. A voice replied back to him, "My husband, why have you come so late? I have already eaten of the cooking furnace of Yomi and cannot return. Nevertheless, I will ask the gods of the underworld to go with you, but first I must rest. I pray, though, do not look at me." Izanagi, either moved by curiosity or refusal to honor her wish, took out his hair comb and set it on fire for light, although he instantly regretted his action. With the darkness banished, before him was a sight of abject horror. Izanami stood in front of him, a twisted, grotesque mockery of her once radiant person. Her body was swollen, devoid of color, and pulsing with maggots. Clinging to her were numerous thunder and fire spirits, who upon seeing the light of fire and a living soul screamed with their great otherworldly voices. Izanami gazed upon her husband to see him shaking with revulsion. She cried out, "You have shamed me by not honoring my wishes." In her rage, she unleashed the thunder deities which clung to her thigh at Izanagi. Her brother husband ran as fast as he could, Izanami close behind. When he had reached the entrance to the underworld, Izanagi quickly used a giant rock to seal in his ghastly wife forever in the land of the dead. As Izanami furiously pounded her fists on the rock, Izanagi called out to her that he was getting a divorce. From the other side, Izanami called out that she would strangle 1,000 people a day in revenge, to which he replied that if this was so, he would cause 1,500 children to be born every day. After his trials, Izanagi returned home to purify himself from the unclean realm. As he removed his robes and adornments, these items became new spirits. When he washed his face, new gods came forth. From his left eye came Amaterasu, goddess of the sun. From his right eye came Tsukiyomi, god of the moon. And from his nose came Susanoo, the tempestuous god of storms. Having been cleansed and his task to populate the world complete, Izanagi built an abode on the island of Ahaji, where he went to dwell in silence and gloom forever. The moral of the story here, of course, is there's a right time to ask for something and a wrong time. But the Japanese creation myth offers a unique take on the history of that country, namely that the islands of Japan were specifically created solely for the Japanese. Being the favored children of the gods gives one a certain nationalistic confidence. This will play out later when Japan is forced to confront Mongol invaders, and again with Westerners looking for new markets. We're also given a glimpse into traditional Japanese social etiquette. The myth clearly outlines the risks for women being too forward. Naturally, if you're a girl looking to make the first move, whoa, watch out. Your future children will come out all horribly disfigured, or possibly as an island. Maybe. The mythological themes here briefly touch on the earth diver, in that the Naginata spear carries water instead of mud. There are also new themes, like the world parent, who gives birth to not just the people, but also the land. And then there's the ex nihilo myth, literally out of nothing. Where'd that egg that became the reed sprouts come from? Was there a giant cosmic chicken that laid it? And that would just create more questions, because did the cosmic chicken come from its own cosmic egg? There's no explanation or reason at all for this stuff, and we're just going to have to accept it or get a really bad headache thinking about it. Oh, and one last thing, this myth sets up the origins of the Japanese imperial line, starting with the first mythical emperor, Jimmu, who is a son of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Divine ancestry is always a big bonus for emperors and kings, after all. For our last myth, we shift to Mesopotamia and the great empire of Babali, the gateway of God. This is the home of the Babylonians, who were kind enough to write down their creation myth, the Enuma Elish. Although some of it has been lost to the ages, a good enough chunk survives for us to hear this exciting tale. At the dawn of time, the earth was empty. Apsu, god of fresh waters, Tiamat, goddess of the salt oceans, and Mumu, their minister, were all as one. Apsu and Tiamat eventually created new gods, and those gods begat even more gods. Greatest among them was Ea, who had magical powers. His brothers and sisters may not have been as mighty, but they were many. Too many, in fact. There were so many of these cacophonous gods that Apsu couldn't sleep. The noise kept Tiamat up as well, but she was content knowing her children and grandchildren were happy and numerous. Apsu didn't share his lover's attitude and grew angry and irritated until he could stand it no more and told Tiamat he intended to slay them all with Mumu's help. Tiamat begged him not to, but his mind was made up. Now Ea got word of his grandfather's schemes and used his magic to remove Apsu's crown, the source of his power, and slew him. He dragged Mumu away in ropes and used his form to build a palace atop Apsu's freshwater body. There, along with his wife, the goddess Damkina, they fathered the four-eared, four-eyed, fire-breathing giant god Marduk. The murder of Apsu enraged Tiamat, and all maternal obligations towards her children ceased altogether. She took a new mate, the god Kingu, and birthed an army of dragons, vipers, hellhounds, scorpion men, and other fearsome monsters. She gave to Kingu the tablets of destiny for protection, for it is said that whomever wields the tablets will rule the universe. Fearful of their mother's army, the gods called on Ea for help, hoping his magical powers would save them. Ea, however, realized that even his powers were not strong enough, and so he called on his son Marduk to be his champion. Marduk agreed to fight for his father, on condition that after his victory, he would rule over the gods. Ea agreed and armed his son with arrows of the wind, a net, a club, an invincible spear, and lightning. Marduk went forth after the foul army, besting them all and sending Kingu fleeing until Tiamat was all that remained. The primordial being transformed herself into a dreadful beast and fought him mercilessly. Finally, Marduk ensnared her with his nets, while Tiamat struggled to get free. As she opened wide her great and toothy maw, he unleashed a barrage of wind arrows, creating a gale that filled her lungs with air and preventing her mouth from closing. Seizing the opportunity with alacrity, Marduk took his spear and plunged it down Tiamat's gullet, piercing her heart. Tiamat was now dead, and when her minions saw what had become of their mother goddess, they trembled and took flight. But Marduk caught them in his net and broke their weapons. He then grabbed the tablets of destiny from Kingu, but did not kill him. He still might be useful. Marduk had achieved much, but his work was not yet finished. He took his club and split Tiamat's body in half. With one half, he placed it in the sky to make the heavens and the moon. The other half was placed over Apsu's fresh waters to make the land. From her eyes, he made the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. From her tail, he formed the Milky Way. And from various other organs and body parts, he created the rivers, mountains, stars, fields, and all the features of the world. Marduk then built a home worthy of his greatness and called this new place Babylon, the gateway of the gods. For it shall be the conduit for which the gods in heaven visit the earth. Reveling in victory, Marduk reveals his next plan to Ea, his father. Blood I will mass, and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Verily, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that the gods might be at ease. Ea likes the idea and adds his own suggestion. Make this new creature using the blood of a god. No need to search far, because it was time for Kingu to become useful. He is slain, and his blood is spilled and mixed with clay from the earth to create the very first men and women. Ea tasks mankind to toil in the fields, raise animals, and most of all, worship the gods. Marduk, meanwhile, set about dividing the gods up and assigning them positions in heaven and earth and bringing order to the land. Grateful for their prosperity and for all he had done, the gods finally proclaimed Marduk king of the gods of heaven and earth. Oh yeah, Marduk rocks. There's also definitely a good bit of subliminal Freudian stuff going on in this myth, and the Enuma Elish is pretty gory as far as they come. Yet there's even an archetypal theme here too, the redemptive violence myth, as coined by the theologian Walter Wink. These are stories where a happy ever after outcome is prefaced by some serious violent struggle. The Earth wouldn't exist if Marduk hadn't ripped Tiamat's corpse apart. Mankind wouldn't exist if Kingu hadn't been drained of his blood. Our existence, albeit as slaves to the Babylonian pantheon, is almost inherently brutal. The Cherokee myth seems downright Disney at this point. Although I propose for your consideration that conflict is the common thread throughout each of these myths. Each one of these stories illustrates some problem or dilemma that can only be resolved through fighting or violence. It's pretty obvious with Marduk over here, but Izanagi and Izanami are stuck in this endless cycle of life and death, and even the animals of the Cherokee myth decide that the only way to combat this weirdly aggressive new creature is to invent plague. Ugh. Now to be fair, not every creation myth has to involve death and destruction. The Kumulipo, the creation myth of Hawaii, for example, is an incredibly beautiful account of the creation of the islands and of the various flora and fauna that inhabit it. It also describes the origins of the Hawaiian royal lineage, and if you got the time, you should check it out, although it is a fairly long read. Except, even the Kumulipo has some fighting in it. Nobody dies, but there is jealousy over who slept with who, and you know how those things can escalate. So is this it? Does the prevalence of bloodshed in creation myths speak volumes about our earliest civilizations? Can we safely extrapolate from these stories that early man was a brutish, nasty thing? Or that some societies just really loved violence more than others? That theologian Walter Wink used the example of the Genesis creation to essentially show how much nicer the Bible is compared to all the weird gore-obsessed cultures throughout history. Well, I mean, he is a bit biased, after all he was a Methodist minister, but fair enough, Genesis is pretty beautiful in its simplicity. God makes everything in 6 days and takes a break on the 7th. No temperamental ocean dragons, no vindictive wildlife, just existence. But then there's the rest of Genesis, like Cain and Abel, the Great Flood, the destruction of Sodom, the binding of Isaac. Well, that falls apart pretty fast. Well, maybe we can just say that the predominance of all this carnage and aggression simply reflects a time when the world was pretty violent. If bandits didn't shank you for not forking over your gold fast enough, then perhaps that army of Gudians would make mincemeat of you. Or you could get mauled by wild animals, or how about a nice disfiguring infectious disease? These stories reflect an uncertain and dangerous world where life could be nasty, brutish, and short. Thanks, Hobbes. And yet, maybe there's an even simpler answer. Consider some of the great adventure stories of today's world. Would Raiders of the Lost Ark be as fun if Indy just fought his way through the Nazis through the power of friendship? Or if Luke and Darth Vader hug it out the first time they meet? Or how about Batman uses his parents' death to donate his money to charity and fund a series of free mental health clinics for the supervillains? Conflict, and by proxy violence, ultimately make a story more interesting. There's just no getting around it. Take a look at any summer blockbuster and you'll see what I'm talking about. I mean, my God, does Michael Bay get paid by the explosion? These stories, all of them through time, seek to inspire and entertain. The hero never gets hurt. Stormtroopers never hit Luke. Villains always strap James Bond to some crazy killing machine and then they just leave the room. Just freaking shoot the guy! And it's for this reason that these stories will always survive, because ultimately it's about mankind projecting its desires and beliefs and transcending what we know to be real. Next time, we move away from the realm of myth and get into some real history. Our story begins on the lush and fertile plains of Africa, where some 4 million years ago, some very brave primates decided they were done with life in the treetops. Perhaps there's something worth doing on the, ground? Sounds crazy, but it all starts somewhere, and that's where we're going to start our journey on the podcast history of our world.